So welcome. My name is David Serlin, and it's my great pleasure to welcome not only all of you to this session, we're going to be talking about the creative process, but also to welcome my two guests who are going to be joining me as part of that conversation. I'm going to introduce them in just a moment, but before I do, just wanted to ask those of you who have cell phones and things like that if you could turn them off or silence them and so forth, because we don't want lots of interruptions while we're talking. The second thing is that after our session today, Brian, who I'm going to introduce in a second, is going to be signing autographs from 4 to 5 in the autograph area. So just to bear that in mind. So when I was asked to moderate this panel, which I was very happy to do, I was thinking to myself, what does it mean to be an artist who works in multiple formats and multiple mediums? We're very accustomed to thinking of an artist as someone who does one kind of thing. But actually, when you think about it, an artist is often someone who can pick up just about any kind of medium, any kind of instrument, any kind of form, and express themselves through it. And I think the people that we have on our panel today are great examples of what you might call a multidisciplinary or a multimedia artist. People who work within and between different kinds of fields and are enormously, not just successful, but also enormously gifted at them. So let me introduce our two panelists today.
Excited to find out about it.
So sitting directly to my left is Julianne Moore. I probably don't have to tell you that Julianne has been appeared in over 70 off-Broadway and film and television roles. She is an acclaimed actress who has won numerous awards, BAFTA, Golden Globe, SAG, Emmys, both primetime and daytime. That's a very important distinction. Ask Ms. Susan Lucci. And she was nominated for 5 Academy Awards, one of which she won just this year for Still Alice. But in addition to being an award-winning actress, many of you know that Julianne is also the author of a series of children's books, some of which I have here, which I'll hold up in just a second. In 2007, she published her first book, Freckleface Strawberry, which was a New York Times bestseller. And that book was turned into a musical in 2010, Freckleface Strawberry, the musical. After that, Freckleface Strawberry appeared in a couple of other books, Freckleface Strawberry and the Dodgeball Bully in 2009. In 2011, Freckleface Strawberry and Witty Pants Patrick, Best Friends Forever. And then in 2013, she published a book that doesn't contain the Freckleface Strawberry character called Mom is a Foreigner. I'm sorry, my gosh. My mom is a foreigner, but she's my mom. But not to me, excuse me. But right. My mom is a foreigner, but not to me. Thank you. And then this year, in a couple of months, at the end of June, she'll be publishing 2 new books that return to the Freckleface Strawberry character. This one is called Lunch, or What's That?
David's doing the audiobooks, by the way.
And Backpacks. And all of these books in the Freckleface Strawberry series were illustrated by Lei Win Pham, who you can tell has a remarkable and unique style. So at any rate, I'm so happy to invite to have Julie here so that we can talk about her work in the context of BookCon. So,
Phew! What an introduction! Oh my God!
And then directly to Julie's left is Brian Selznick. Brian, as you know, is the author and illustrator of over 25 books. Most recently, the book Wonderstruck, which was published in 2011. In 2008, Brian was awarded the Caldecott Medal for his book, The Invention of Hugo Cabret, which was made in 2011 into a little film by an obscure director named Martin Scorsese. But many of you might not know that Brian is also a puppeteer and a set designer and collaborator with lots of artists in different media. So what we have here are people who have been interested in and have given over their creative selves to many different kinds of artistic practices and many different kinds of artistic mediums. So today we're going to be talking about creativity as well as the individual projects that you've been involved in.
I have a question though.
Yes.
Who are you?
Oh, my name is David Serlin, and I'm a professor of communication and media studies at the University of California, San Diego.
Yeah.
And yes,
And what else? Come on.
oh, am I supposed to say that?
Yes.
Full disclosure.
I think.
Okay,
come
full
on.
disclosure. I know these two people personally, one of whom I know a little bit better than the other because
You're married to one of us.
That's
Ryan
right.
is my husband.
Yes. Yeah.
But we can't say which.
Right.
You have to
to
guess.
decide who I'm married
Yeah.
to.
By the end of the
Okay.
session, you'll guess. It'll be a show of hands.
I didn't know I could say it. Of course. Okay. Well then, this is going to get really personal really quickly. Okay. Julie and husband Brian, I want to ask both of you a little bit about the creative process, and not just about as I say, the projects that you've been involved in, but sort of where you start. So, Julie, when you are thinking about working on a book, let's say the Freckleface Strawberry book or
Right.
the other books
Right.
that we have here, where do you start? For you, where do you begin?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I never ever thought I would be in the children's book world or in the book world at all, and until I had a friend of mine who had just moved from journalism, the magazine world, into kind of being a book agent, said to me sort of off the cuff, you should write a book about your childhood for your children. They would love it. And I said, children don't care about your childhood. They care about their childhood. They don't want to hear anything that's happened to you. And so I kind of dismissed it. I really didn't think about writing anything. And then I was on a plane to London, and that's the only time I had time alone because I did have two small children. And it was so long ago, I still had a filofax. And yeah.
Oh my God, that's the 19th century?
I know, right? And I wrote, and I remembered this nickname that I had. My son was 7 years old, and when kids are 7, that's when they just begin to notice their physicality, and they don't like it. They're kind of oblivious to themselves physically until then, but at 7, their big teeth start to come in. They're like, my teeth are so big, and mommy, my ears are so big, and why is this happening? And it broke my heart because he was so beautiful, and I thought, why would he be self-conscious at all? And this nickname I had when I was 7 years old was Freckleface Strawberry, because of obvious reasons. And
What was it?
the Freckleface Strawberry. And I hated it. I hated it. And I was very self-conscious. I was very, very self-conscious about my hair, and particularly my freckles, because we were living in Nebraska at the time, and everyone was tan, and people thought I looked weird. So it was that impetus. It was my son feeling self-conscious, and my remembering the kind of the nature of my self-consciousness. And I thought, okay, so where's this come? So it was just that story. So then it just kind of came out. I think people talk about that a lot, about a story just sort of coming out. But generally there's some kind of idea. There's like a gem of an idea, and it can come from your life. It can come from an observation. Dodgeball was, once again, I hate dodgeball. Hated it. And I was just thinking, when I was trying to write the second one, I was like, what did I hate? I hated dodgeball. It's like, my acting manager actually made a joke. She goes, are you just going to go through all of your childhood traumas? Next is going to be Freckleface Strawberry gets glasses. But that's kind of what it was. That's really how it started. You go.
And for me,
Yeah.
it was your kids also.
That's right, yeah.
Who I was worried about. I feel like, I think for me, once I decided that I wanted to become a writer and illustrator of children's books, everything tied back to what it was that I remembered from when I was a kid that I still am interested in. And most of the main interests that I have now are still connected to the things that I loved when I was a kid, like monsters and movies and magic and museums and things that for some reason all start with the letter M.
Yes.
And very alphabetical. And so, my first book, The Houdini Box, which came out in 1991, was based on a project I had done in school about, we had been given an assignment to do something about Houdini, and I had loved Houdini when I was a kid, and so I wrote a story about a kid who gets to meet Houdini, handed it in as this project for school. It wasn't originally for kids. And then after I graduated from college and I decided that I would get into children's books, I got a job at a children's bookstore. I decided that I needed to make a book so that I could show people that this is something that I can do. And I remembered that story, and the main character was 10, and it was about Houdini. And so I rewrote it and added more pictures and sent it around. And almost everything that I've done since then that I've written connects to something that was very important to me when I was a kid. But then for a lot of my career, I've also illustrated books by other people, and the ones that excite me the most and the ones that I've said yes to are stories that in some fashion, often for an unknown reason, speak to me on some sort of deep interest, I don't know, spiritual level on some, in some fashion. And then I dive in and illustrate it. But the ones that I write all come from things that are just my own personal interests.
Highly, highly personal, I'd say. I mean, I think that's what's interesting, and I think that's what we recognize when we read your books, is how specific they are, how personal they are, and I think that that's probably pretty much how every artist works when they're working on anything, and I do it when I'm working in acting too. I always say that when you find the most personal thing, the thing that means the most to you, you will have hit on the most universal idea, because we can sense it. We sense it in work, we sense it in art, and in movies, and in books, and we don't know why we respond to it. We respond to it because it's true, because it's personal.
Well, so Freckleface Strawberry is a kid who is dealing with being different in some way and trying to figure out how to be a particular kind of kid when she feels very self-conscious about herself. Hugo and some other characters in your books, they also deal with some kind of difference about being, I don't want to use the word outsider, but somehow they feel very self-conscious about who they are. How does that tie in with the way that you think about casting a book like Freckleface or any of the books? That sense of being, if not an outsider per se, then somehow dealing with being different from other people.
Yeah, I was actually just reading a quote from Alison Bechdel, who wrote Fun Home, which has been adapted for a brilliant Broadway musical. And she was saying that she used to get frustrated when people would read her books and say, oh, this is I know it's about gay themes, but it's really universal, like everyone can relate to it. And she would sort of bristle at that, but then she talked about how she's come to accept that because everybody feels like an outsider. Yes. Everybody has that sense in some fashion, and I think that's what we're tying in with when you talk about what led to the creation of Freckleface Strawberry.
It's a tongue twister.
It is hard to say.
Freckleface Strawberry.
Freckleface Strawberry. And then the characters like Hugo or Ben in Wonderstruck, who are trying to figure out how they fit in this world and what it means to have a friend, because that's also a big part of it.
That's the nature of existence, I mean, that's the interesting thing, and that's what we're all kind of fighting on a philosophical level, is that we all feel that once you gain consciousness and you know that you're separate from your mother, then you feel different, you feel alone. So your whole process as an adult is about how do I go from my otherness, my separateness, into a feeling of belonging. And once again, one of the places where we do feel that we belong again and again and again is in art. That's another place that we go when we feel like we're not understood. When I was a kid, the thing about reading, the thing that I loved about reading, and is that I'd read something and I'd say, well, how did they know that about me? Which is a very profound feeling to have when you're 6, 7, 8 years old,
and it feels personal.
Yeah, it's exciting.
Well, and then in both of your works, Hugo and Isabel become friends. They form a family. Ben and Jamie become friends. And Freckleface Strawberry and Wendy Patrick
That's
become
right. Best friends forever.
Yeah. So there's that moment of recognition that you feel like an outsider, but then there's someone who is himself or herself going through their own struggles, and then you can find a bond with,
That's right.
and then you feel much less alone.
You. Someone sees you, and not only sees you. In the case of, it really seems so silly when I'm saying the case of Freckleface and Windy Pants, but
talk a little bit more about Windy Pants Patrick.
Let me expound on this. In their case, Freckleface is frightened. And she's afraid of that ball, and so she gets bigger and bigger and bigger until she's imagining herself a monster, and she growls at him. And this big kid who seems impervious to fear is afraid, and she has to say to him, I was just pretending, I'm not, So she's the one that has to come down from her fear and whatever. So I think that's the other, once again, it's that moment of recognition that someone is as afraid as you, someone is as alone as you, and the only way to breach it is to go to them. I think often children feel, or people feel like, when is anybody going to see me? When is anybody going to recognize me? When is somebody going to come to me? Then how do you learn? I think the process of growing up is to learn that you don't have to wait for things to come to you, that you can go to them.
That's right.
Yeah, and how do you learn to trust somebody? What does it mean to trust this person, especially someone who you're initially afraid of, or someone who you don't fully understand? And I feel like in each of these books that I've written as well, there's that sense of these people, these characters, these kids meeting each other and then trying to figure out, it's almost like they're doing a dance where they're trying to figure out how they can trust each other and then what happens when they do. And when after I finished The Invention of Hugo Cabret, a reader came up to me when I was on tour and talked about how they loved that the book was ultimately about how you make your own family. Yeah. And I didn't know that was what my book was about. I knew I did that. I knew I wanted Hugo to be safe at the end, but I don't really think in terms of themes when I'm writing. I think very much in terms of plot and what happens. And all of a sudden I was like, oh my gosh, it is about how we make our own family, which is then the theme that carried through with Wonderstruck and with the new and the Marvels. But it seems it's interesting to think about these. There are so many overlaps between what's happening in Freckleface Strawberry and in these ideas, with these ideas as well.
It could be somebody's thesis.
Yeah, I think so.
Right?
Yeah. The dissertation is waiting to be written.
Right here, yeah, exactly.
So you started to describe how these kind of memories of childhood, or kind of thinking about it, and let's say in your case, Julie, the kids that are in your life. So that becomes the inspiration, but then it comes to the point of actually putting the words on paper,
right,
and translating these ideas into a book, or a book and words and pictures for you, Brian. So what happens in that process? From sitting on a plane and writing into a file of facts, from sitting in your studio or looking at your computer screen, and then that process to get from these ideas to the page. What does something?
Your editor's here today, so
yeah, right. That's a tough one. And my husband's a writer. He writes screenplays and he directs them, and he'll spend years on a screenplay. And obviously, it's a much larger process. And Brian's process is much broader than a picture book. An early reader. And my husband makes these jokes that I remember I couldn't write something. I was like the whole year. I'm like, I'm blocked. I can't do it. I can't get anything down. I'm blocked. And then he went downstairs, and he was making chicken paillard or something like that and pounded it out. And 20 minutes later, I said, here it is. And he was like, God damn it. Like, why? And I said, no, but I literally couldn't think of anything for a year. So it was in my head. It was in my head for a year. So I couldn't figure out what the story was, what was going to happen, what they would say to each other, where it went. And then, because it is obviously a picture book, it can take 20 minutes to actually write it down. It's different for somebody who's writing something longer. But I don't think, I think that's the hardest thing to explain to somebody, like with acting too, like how do you do it? And you're like, I don't know. I really don't know.
Right, because it's not just the 20 minutes that it might take to write the actual words. It's that year of thinking about it and having things settle. And because I feel like this, when I'm working, I start with just a very very few specific plot points usually, or like sometimes there's a setting, or like a boy finds a broken machine, like that was all I had for Hugo for a really long time. And discovered that one. I had the benefit of the fact that George Méliès was a real person, so I was able to research Méliès and do and read about his life and then build the skeleton of the story around his actual biography. But most of the time it feels like I'm not writing. And it seems like if you don't actually have your hand on the keyboard or your hand on a pen, that you're not working. But you are working when it's churning and sort of formulating in your head. I mean, and I still feel bad when I'm writing and I get stuck and I fall asleep a lot or take a nap, or I feel and I feel bad about myself.
But my husband does too, yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
It's still really good to hear when other people, suffer. And
But I think it's because we think that there's some difference between being out in the world and walking around and going to see a movie and sitting down and writing, but actually they're all part of the process.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing that's also probably true for you as an actor too. The stuff you take in then becomes factored into the way that you put things out on screen.
Absolutely everything, particularly when you're in the research part of it. Like you said, if you happen to have any real information, I think when you're writing or when you're acting, I really pounce on it. I mean, I'm really a stickler for accuracy about that stuff, because it's in that information that's where all the doors are opened. That's where you understand everything. And it's kind of amazing if you rely on somebody else's research, how much gets missed, because they're not looking for the same things that you are. So you really have to go in there and kind of do it yourself. And even in the case of my mom is a foreigner. I mean, that came out of my experiences having a mother I'm first generation. My mother was from Scotland, so I wanted to write a book about my experience, and all of the things that are in there, all of the really silly things are specific things that were specific to me and to other people that I knew who were first generation. I remember I was getting my hair done in a trailer for a movie years ago, and the hairstylist told me how embarrassed she was when she and her cousin would go to school and they had to heat up their lunch in the microwave because their grandmother had made it and she was Italian, and then it exploded and neither one of them would go up there to clean it up because they didn't want people to know that was their smelly food that was different. So that's in the book, talking about all the kind of funny things that people make and the hairdos that my mother used to braid my hair, which was something that American children didn't do as often, and I did it to my daughter, and so all the really, really specific things that happen end up in your work somehow.
Yeah. No, all of that is what ultimately, I mean, for me it's sort of transferring that personal experience to the reader. Yeah. So that if I'm researching something like I did a book about a 19th century artist who built the first life-size sculptures of dinosaurs called the Dinosaurs of Waterhouse Hawkins, and his dinosaur sculptures are still standing in England. And the ability to go to England, to go to Sydenham Park, and Sydenham is the name of the town, right? The city.
Yeah,
and then it's Crystal Palace Park, where the dinosaurs are still standing, and to go onto the island and to touch the dinosaurs and to climb inside of them and smell the smell and have that feeling. That is what I'm thinking about when I'm doing the final art, not just the photographs that I took of what it looked like. Yeah, I'm thinking about all of those experiences.
And I think about the experience that I had at the Queen's Museum when I saw the big kind of, what's it called?
The panorama.
Panorama, yeah. And I saw it after I had read Wonderstruck too, and I'm like, look, here's the place and the thing in the book that I read about that Brian wrote, and then it kind of textualizes it for me in a completely different way, and so exciting. It's so exciting to have what you believe, thank you, is an imaginary world, which in fact is not imaginary, collide with your reality.
Yeah, and that idea that you can then finish a book and then go into the real place. You can go to the dinosaurs, you can go to the Queen's Museum and see the panorama. You can have that experience, But the goal is to try to translate that through the medium of the book and have it get across to the reader.
Well, let's talk a little bit about translation, because Brian, obviously you write and illustrate your own books, so that you have control over how you want people to read and visualize it. But Julie, you collaborate with
That's
artists.
right. Yeah.
And Lei Win Pham, who is the illustrator for the Freckleface Strawberry books, and then
Melo So.
Excuse me, is the illustrator. How is that for you? How is that process of collaboration? And also, is it different than collaborating, let's say, on a film where you're working with a range of different people to produce, a particular character?
Yeah, it is very interesting. I mean, when I was first searching for an illustrator for Freckleface Strawberry, I was talking to various different publishers about publishing it, and what they did, this is all new to me, I didn't know how this worked. They would then suggest, when they were talking about my manuscript, they would, kind of put forth a list of illustrators and say, is there anybody here that you like, and so on, blah, blah, blah. And I kept seeing Lei Win at every meeting. I kept seeing Lei Win stuff, and she was the only one I wanted. It was the only, I saw a book that she'd done, and I was like, that's it, that's her, that's the one, that's the illustration, that's what I want. Yeah.
Well, what was it about this character or this style that kind of appealed to you?
It was the life, I think, in her characters. It was the personality. She had a background also in animation, and I felt like I was sort of looking for. I wanted the sense of movement in it, and what they do too, they send your manuscript to an illustrator blind without like a name on it. I was very nervous because this wasn't my regular business and stuff. And then they say whether or not they are going to respond to it or not. And she responded right away. And then they said, "Oh, it's Julianne Moore's." And hopefully, thank goodness she wasn't like, "No." And then it goes through, and your editor is the one who kind of translates things. They very rarely, I guess you do sometimes, I don't work directly with the illustrator. It kind of goes through the editor so that everyone's heard equally. But I really, with both of my illustrators, I never had any issues because I felt like they understood the text. And I think that I think that's what you're looking for. You can see it in their art. With Melo So, she comes from a very different kind of art background. She's much more from the illustrators rather than animation, of kind of a more painterly approach. But her women, I'd seen a book, I wanted the moms to look like real moms, these beautiful, beautiful real women with great bodies and great faces, and I kept seeing that in her work. And oddly, this is so weird, Melo was born in Hong Kong and lives in Scotland and is a foreign mom of a Scottish child. My mother was born in Scotland, came to America as a Scottish mom of an American child. That was completely a coincidence. But she, read my manuscript and wanted to do it because she's like, I'm a foreign mom. I want to write this for my daughter. And I'm like, well, I'm writing this for my mother. So it was, it really,
perfect.
Yeah, it was kind of perfect. Weird synchronicity.
Well, it's right. It's these kinds of translations. So you're translating your childhood experiences and writing your books. Right. And then you have these amazing illustrators, who are able to translate your own ideas and put them into context that will then be appealing to people on lots of different levels.
Right.
And then they're also finding their own personal place in story inside that narrative, and so in order for that kind of collaboration to work, both parties have to have the same kind of deeply personal connection.
Yeah.
And that's what's so beautiful about what you just said, is that you both have that coming from different
perspectives. And there's a character in as Freckleface proceeds, there's a character named Winnie, and that is Lei Win, actually.
Oh. That's good to know.
I know. I mean, that's what I wrote. I wanted Freckleface to have a friend, and a friend who loved art, and so that's Winnie. Where is she? Want to find it? Maybe she's in Lunch or What's That? Yeah, Lunch or What's That?
David will get it right when he does the audiobook.
Lunch or What's That?
Where's Winnie? Yeah, what's that?
What's that?
Here's Winnie.
We're all auditioning.
Yeah.
Here she is. There's Winnie. She's back there. She's back there with a little haircut.
She's laughing.
Yeah, she's laughing.
Oh,
She doesn't know what
fantastic.
that is. But anyway. Look, she looks shocked here. Absolutely shocked. Okay.
So, and Brian, you obviously illustrate and write the books, but you collaborate with graphic designers and layout folks. So there are, even though you have a role in both the way the book is illustrated and written. You have to collaborate with people in order to make your books look the way that you want them to.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a collaboration. I mean, my illustrator has to do what I tell him to do all the time because he's
you,
me.
yeah.
And so,
Brian, get to work. Okay, Brian.
So a little bit what it's like. And but it's probably the closest collaborator is my editor Tracy Mack at Scholastic, and I will very often tell her the very first. I think that's Tracy now, remembering how hard it was to make all of these books. We both mostly just cry for 3 years, but then at the end we have the invention of Hugo Cabret and Wonderstruck and the Marvels, and so. I will often write to her, give her a call, and say, I have an idea. I want to set a story around a kid who meets George Méliès, or finds this broken machine, or a story about a deaf kid like that. And literally, that's all I have. And so I think with Wonderstruck, I put together a giant scrapbook of articles that I found interesting that were related to museums in different ways, and libraries, and books, and tragedies, and just a big giant scrapbook. And then I wrote a list of probably 10 or 20 pages of stories I'd heard, anecdotes that I'd heard that interested me, that somehow felt like they could all be part of a story, although I had no idea what the story was, and I basically just sent all of that to Tracy, and she went through the list of stories, and she was like, this doesn't really seem like this would be in the same book as this, and she just sort of went through, weeded out some of the stuff, and some of what was left ended up becoming part of elements of the narrative in Wonderstruck, because for instance, in Wonderstruck, I knew in the beginning I wanted to write a story about a deaf kid that was told visually, because when I was working on the invention of Hugo Cabret, one of the other things that someone told me after the book was published, that they really liked the silence of the pictures. Because Hugo tells the single narrative about handing back and forth between the words and the pictures, but when you're reading, usually if you're a hearing person, and you're reading a book to yourself silently, in some fashion you hear inside your head the voices, the words themselves in a row, but then you get to the pictures in Hugo, and even though the narrative is continuing, you don't have the same language that is telling it. So the language switches off, and you're now following the story, but unrelated to language. Right. And then it hands back and back and forth. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. I never really thought about them as quiet or silent, but I can see that. And then when I was thinking about what Wonderstruck was going to be, I actually knew first that I was going to tell 2 different stories, one with words and one with pictures. So the question was, how do I justify a story just with pictures? And I thought, oh, the silence is interesting, and if you're born deaf, then most of the way you experience the world is visually. And so maybe if I told the story of a deaf girl all through pictures, it would help us as the reader get a slight sense of what her experience might be like. So all of that sort of went into that idea to tell this story in this visual sense, and my illustrator had to do what I said.
That's beautiful. I love that.
So with just a little bit of time left, because I want to make sure that there's an opportunity for members of the audience, if they have questions, to ask questions, I just want to talk a little bit about the books that are going to be coming out this year. So Julie, you have these 2 that we've already talked a little bit about, these 2 young readers, early readers, lunch or what's that, and then backpacks. Is making a book for a slightly younger reader a different kind of challenge than it is to make books that are for either slightly older or that are more focused on?
It's not terribly
the
different.
language in
I
a
have to
particular
say, one of the things that I really enjoyed about it is that you're really writing directly to the reader in this case, which I enjoyed. With a picture book, you're writing to the person who's being read to, and to the person who's reading it, who's generally a parent. So sometimes in a picture book, there might be like something slightly for both, for both audiences, something that's a little funny that only a parent is going to get, and that a little kid can kind of appreciate, and the sentence structure might be somewhat more complicated. And in an early reader, you can't use compound words, and you don't use contractions, and it's what I liked about it. And the thing about Freckleface for me is that I've always wanted to be directly from the point of view of the child. And in the early readers, it's very easy to do that because the world exists in her school, in first grade or whatever. So in a sense, I kind of like it because I feel like I know exactly where my audience is. I know what they care about. They care about lunch. They
Well, who doesn't?
Then who doesn't? But having had little kids, when you try to get them to talk about their day, the first thing you say is, "What did you have for lunch?" Because they'll remember and they'll tell you, and you kind of go through that kind of thing. So it's a big event in their day. And where do they sit? And do they pick up their own food? And and backpacks. They all have backpacks. They give them a backpack. It's so sweet. Like in kindergarten, they start to learn to carry the backpack with nothing in it. So they're just practicing wearing the backpack. So just that idea, so that was the first one, backpacks, and that's why it has an exclamation point after it.
And like life, as they get older, it becomes
It becomes heavier, that's
heavier,
right.
until they're dragging it on the floor.
Yeah. But I like that. I really, really have, as I've kind of gone through this process of writing for children, I've liked trying to find the line to them. What's important to them? What are they caring about?
Well, the language is so pared down. I was saying to Brian that, it sounds a little bit like Ernest Hemingway. "That is lunch," said Freckleface. "Oh," said Winnie. "But what is it?" Freckleface said sadly, "I do not know."
That's right. Exactly. And it's also obviously a little bit of a play on who's on first.
Yes.
So it's that old joke, which we all find funny, and one kid comes in, and then another kid comes in, and and they keep repeating the same things, and even the kids know instinctively what the payoff is going to be. That they don't know what it is, but they're going to try it anyway. So you're always, and I'm always looking for that too. Like, what do kids find? They have a sense of humor. Yeah. They know, and they want to feel the payoff coming too.
But in the process, you're also experimenting for yourself with a different kind of form. I mean, to say that it's simplistic is, I think, misses the point. It's direct and it pares things down, and it's very actually to kind of remove all that stuff and kind of get to this core. What's going on at that lunch? What's in that backpack? What is it? It's kind of amazing to pare things down.
Thank you. It's fun. It's an interesting way to work, to think like where is the story?
Yeah.
What would somebody say? What do they say? Why, they are in their own secret world too. Occasionally these children get too loud and people tell them to be quiet. So then you're like, "Oh, okay, I'll be quiet. We have to talk about lunch quietly." That sense of that separateness too, of being a kid and being an adult.
Right. And Brian, you also have a book coming out.
Yeah, but I haven't pared it down very much.
But, this is the opposite of those books. And so this is
I need to take your advice.
This is the advanced reader's copy of Brian's forthcoming book, The Marvels, which will come out in September 15, 2015, which is not pared down, but it is in fact an extension of what you've been doing with Hugo and with Wonderstruck. Can you say a little bit about the book?
Yes, so basically the idea was, if Hugo is one story with words and pictures, where the pictures are supposed to echo what is happening in a silent movie, because the book was very much about silent movies, and Wonderstruck is supposed to use pictures in a way to echo the life of this deaf girl. What's the next way that I can figure out what pictures could mean? Because that's what interests me, is what does the structure and the form mean? Why are we using pictures? And so for this one, the answer sort of comes through in the story itself, so I don't want to say too much, but for what I did here was I told all of the visual story first. So you get 400 pages of pictures first.
This part in my hand, this is the picture part, and then this is the text part.
You close it and you can see the...
So one is, the white part is all text.
Is text, which is...
And the dark gray part is all pictures.
Yeah.
It's the same story?
It's ultimately the same story. The picture story begins in 1766, follows 5 generations of red-headed actors.
What? Is there a part for me?
What an interesting coincidence. We'll talk later.
Okay.
Until there's a... I just realized that. That's really funny. Oh my God, you're going to be so good in the movie.
Oh my God, I am.
Right, I thought that was the plan all along.
David. And then so you follow 5 generations of these actors up through 1900. There's a cliffhanger, and then you turn the page, and the next 200 pages is a story entirely in text that takes place in 1990 over the course of a week. And that second story is about a boy who's run away from school, who's looking for an uncle who he's never met. And the uncle's living in this very strange house, and the boy begins to piece together clues in the second part of the story that make us realize he may be related to the family we've been following.
He'd better be.
I'm not saying a thing.
Otherwise.
I'm not saying a thing. It turns out he's not.
Yeah.
And so, not to give too much away, but then ultimately the pictures become very much about memory and are used in a way that hopefully takes some of what I learned from Hugo and Wonderstruck and then does something new with it. And I did want to say but
Well, I was just going to say, so memory takes us right back to where we started, which was talking about childhood memories. Yeah. Childhood memories, both the more sort of traumatic and sad kind, as well as the more sort of hopeful and exciting kind, and kind of allows you to translate those things. So the excitement of lunch, the excitement of finding an uncle in a strange house in an abandoned part of London, they kind of all bring sort of memory and the present together in really interesting ways. One last thing I wanted to mention before we turn it over to the audience is, Brian, it was just announced about a week or so ago that Wonderstruck is going to be made into a film.
That's right.
And by the director Todd Haynes, who has made a few films that Julie has been in. So I thought it was a kind of nice way to tie it together that we have 2 people who have collaborated in terms of presentations like this one, but then also through yet another collaborator, Todd Haynes, sort of they are connected again. And so it'll be really interesting to see how that takes shape. I think the filming is going to be next year, probably, something like that. So we'll have that to look forward to, in addition to the publication of Julie's 2 new books at the end of June and Brian's new book in the middle of September, both of this year.